The Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make such a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in to where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You know, Mark, the Gospel writer, must have had a good editor. Mark tells stories so succinctly that you have to really pay attention or you'll miss the heart of the narrative. Events that other gospel writers spend paragraphs to tell, Mark tells in 1 or 2 sentences. Sometimes Mark even tells 2 stories at once, as in this gospel passage we read today. But this method of telling 2 stories at once isn't to be efficient or concise. It's to open our hearts, to hear something in both stories that we might have missed if they weren't intertwined. What would happen, for instance, if we read these 2 healing stories we heard today without one another? Let's try. Here's the first story we heard. Jesus had been busy. He had been teaching and healing and traveling nonstop. Word of his abilities was spreading, so everywhere he went, crowds surrounded him. Everybody wanted something from him all the time. And Jesus just seemed to have bottomless generosity to just keep giving and giving and giving. Well, Jesus had just returned from a trip, and he was just stepping off the boat when a leader in the local Jewish community came to him, fell on his knees in desperation, and begged, "Please come heal my daughter right away. She's on death's door." And Jesus went with him. Sadly, the daughter had died by the time he got there, and the household was already in mourning. But Jesus went in, took the girl's hand, lifted her up, and made her well. She will live beyond 12 years old. What do you hear in this story? I hear how loved this little girl was. She has a father who tenaciously advocated for her, who used the leverage he had to get her the help she needed. She had a household of family and attendants to care for her and then to grieve her loss. She had her whole life ahead of her, so much potential. I hear in this story also how sometimes God's response to our pleas doesn't come in the timely manner we'd prefer. But God can do things even when we think time and resources have run out. In this story just by itself, without the second story, there are messages of God's generosity and grace, messages of God's healing and care, messages about the importance of community and support. But I wonder, if we only hear this story, who is left out? Mark, the gospel writer, adds another story right in the middle of this one about someone else, a reminder of who might be beyond our sphere of concern, who might be forgotten to us. It's almost like we can take this little girl and step through the mirror of her image to the other side and see someone who is in so many ways her opposite. Imagine now not a 12-year-old girl, but an aging woman who has been ill as long as that girl has been alive. This woman is not supported by a loving family. She advocates only for herself. She is isolated and alone. This woman's medical condition likely meant she was unable to bear children of her own. Was she married, or had her condition cost her that option as well? Her health put her in an ambiguous state in regards to her purity, her ability to live and work and worship normally. She was not well-resourced, as this little girl was, but instead was completely spent, weary, worn down, out of money, out of options. Jesus doesn't come to her, doesn't take her hand as he did with the little girl. Instead, she trails behind him, reaching out toward him, hoping only to grasp the edge of his cloak as he walks away. Jairus, the father of that little girl, important man that he was unhindered by the crowds. Did you notice that? He could come right up to Jesus, but this woman has to push her way through the throngs of people just to get close to Jesus. We don't even learn her name. What happens to her? Who notices her? Who helps her? Well, Jesus does. That's the thing. These two women are in some ways foils of one another, but in other ways, their stories are mirror images of one another because Jesus heals them both. Jesus touches them both, even though it was problematic in both cases. It was not appropriate for Jesus to touch a bleeding woman, and it was also not appropriate for Jesus to touch a dead body. But in the end, their conditions do not infect him. Instead, it is his goodness, his holiness that overflows to them. He makes this little girl not a dead body, but a living person, walking around ready to eat. He makes this woman not a sick pariah, but a restored member of the community. It is not human sickness and death that are contagious in this story, but divine love and restoration. The wholeness that Jesus offers overflows to both women. Jesus touches them both, and Jesus welcomes them both in love. Did you notice that the first thing the father, Jairus, said to Jesus was, "My daughter. My daughter is at the point of death. Please come." And the first thing that Jesus says to the bleeding woman is the same word, daughter. If she has no family to love and support her, Jesus will be that family. Both of these women are restored not only in their bodies, but in their relationships. They are rightly placed back into the sphere of love and family and community. When Jesus heals Jairus' daughter, he dismisses everyone from the house except her immediate family, her mother and her father. to emphasize that this is a healing for all of them as a family. In the end, Jesus makes sure that both of these women are beloved daughters. And then there's this strange thing about all the other people in these two stories. I notice that there's something private about the healing of Jairus' daughter within the safety of her home among only her family. Don't talk about this to anyone, Jesus says. Even though Jairus is an important person in the community, a synagogue leader, this moment could really boost Jesus' reputation, but instead he asks them to stay quiet about it, as if it's just for them. And yet the woman's healing is different. It's as public as you can get, not in the home, but right in the street. She must push through those crowds to get to him. And although she doesn't say anything, he stops and calls all of this out in public. Everyone in the community, and that includes the people who have shunned or neglected or forgotten this woman, everyone hears Jesus call her daughter. Everyone hears Jesus praise her great faith. Everyone hears Jesus call her healed, fully restored. He gives her a voice, makes her story public so that no one can doubt her status, no one can question her faith, no one can start rumors about her or her health. They all saw it, they all heard it. It is worth Jesus' time to stop and attend to this woman to whom no one else is attending. If we, listeners of Mark's gospel, had only heard the story of the little girl, well, we wouldn't even have noticed her there at the edge of the crowd, alone and in need. Right in the midst of one miracle, Jesus shows us that there are always others waiting just outside the scope of our attention for their own miracles. We might not see them, but God does. God does see them. And God makes room for both miracles. How heartbroken Jairus must have been when someone from his household came to tell him that his daughter had died while Jesus had stopped to heal this other woman. Why did Jesus have to stop and waste his time on this woman whose condition had been the same for years? Well, this is why, because she too was a beloved daughter. And because healing her did not mean that Jesus could not heal Jairus' daughter. That is a human scarcity way of thinking. In the economy of God's kingdom, there is enough mercy, enough healing, enough attention, enough goodness, enough wholeness for both of these women. They are not in competition. They are different, opposites, and yet they are the same. Both daughters, both loved, both welcomed into the arms of God's healing. Your story will not be lost by God, even if you get missed or set aside by the world because of your health status or your economic status or your marital status or your social status or whatever other reason the world decides to push people to the margins. God will come and take those at the margins and put them back in the center. There is room for this story too, God will say. There is room for this person too. And God won't have to push anyone else aside to do this. Just as Jesus makes it possible to do both, to heal Jairus' daughter and to heal this bleeding woman, so God can make enough room for all people to come within the sphere of divine love. That's what we see when we look at Jesus, enough for all. And hopefully that's what others see when they look at us, God's church. We get to be recipients of that sufficiency, that profusion of God's mercy and love. And we get to be representatives of it as well. We get to welcome those who have been left out. We get to hear the stories of those who have been silenced. We get to dismantle that narrative of scarcity and replace it with a narrative of abundance. There is enough for you and you and you, both and all. Thanks be to our generous God. Amen.